Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome you all to this fourth session of Strategy Edge 2020. The discussion so far has have been fascinating, featuring some of the best minds in the domain. And today we have a fantastic session on strategic planning in a time of crisis, business beyond COVID. Mr. Stephen Wanker, Managing Director, New Markets Advisors, would be the keynote speaker. Representing the Indian perspective, we also have Mr. Dilip Sawhney, Managing Director, Rockwell Automation India. So without further ado, I would hand it over to you, sir, Mr. Dilip Sawhney.
Well, thank you so much, Jayasuriya. So, Mr. Steve Wunker, Managing Director, New Market Advisors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I take great pleasure in welcoming all of you to the fourth session of Strategy Edge 2020, being organized by CII. It's been a very successful series over the recent years, and in keeping with the needs of the times that we are living in presently, it has been virtualized this year. Just to get started, I think it was Mike Tyson who had famously said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And it does seem that we all got socked in the jaw lately, and by an adversary, that did not even seem to exist until about a year ago, right? And the cliche that we live in a volatile and uncertain world, that's suddenly taken a whole new meaning, a whole new dimension, right? Now, there is, of course, a very high degree of uncertainty today, especially on the economic front, right? And that makes it hard for decision makers to start taking action. A lot of information is floating around, and depending upon what you choose to pay attention to, which source of information you get more influenced by, you can be either an optimist or you could be a pessimist, right? And by the time, it becomes fully clear which one of a whole plethora of scenarios ends up being reality, many strategic actions that you could have taken, while these scenarios were still emerging or still developing, you miss the bus. Either the right options are no longer feasible or they are far too expensive. You got to make sure that you remain flexible where you can be flexible, but also make certain choices and commit to them, so that you can move ahead, even while you're facing uncertainty, right? But how do you balance all of that, right? And what does it mean to have brilliant strategic planning, when the world itself is getting turned upside down? Strategic planning is never an easy business, right? And it's getting just a whole new dimension of complexity, with the onset of this pandemic, right? As business leaders, a vital trait of any successful business leader, is his or her ability to envision the future and translate this vision from concept to reality. This can make all the difference between being successful or failing, right? As India has been grappling with this pandemic and this whole range of unprecedented disruptions that have been occurring on health and safety side, supply chain disruptions and restrictions, limitations around movement, unavailability of your own resources, limitations on manufacturing. Who was prepared for this? Even the most seasoned decision makers, they've found themselves, in pretty much uncharted territory, right? Where the basic fundamentals of business strategy don't seem to intuitively work, right? Now, businesses had to completely, rewire. They had to rethink of the ways of doing business, and only those who leveraged, who had the flexibility and who leveraged, breakthrough strategic thinking, while being agile, while being innovative, have been able to, not only weather the storm but actually come out stronger from this crisis, right? And learnings from the crisis are critical, given that the challenges and potentially the changes presented through this phase of uncertainty are actually going to persist, right? and that requires you to have a whole new way of thinking, even in the post-pandemic period, once we have reached the new normal, right? Or if you want to call it that. So it's absolutely important that we continue to drive innovation and unleash the latent competitiveness that is ingrained in the India ethos in our industrial ecosystem. And it's also my belief that despite all the disruption, despite all the headwind that has existed, India has every factor in its favor today to assume a leadership position in the world. If there's good, strong strategic underpinning, right? So before we begin with the session's proceedings, I would like to introduce our distinguished speaker of the day, Mr. Stephen Wunker. It's a great privilege, Steve, to have you amongst us here, right? Steve, as the Managing Director of New Market Advisors, is a leading consultant on innovation with a particular focus on redefining industries and creating new ones. Steve led the development of one of the world's first smartphones, and he has built and sold several successful businesses. He advises companies worldwide on creating and executing bold plans for growth. With a breathtaking track record on driving innovation and strategic action plans, he has worked across hundreds of companies on 5 different continents. Steve also has he's also widely acclaimed, and he's a prolific author. He's got multiple award-winning books that include Capturing New Markets, Jobs to Be Done, and his most recent book, Cost Ovation. They've all been very well received by audiences across the globe, right? Aside from his books, he also writes for Forbes, for Harvard Business Review, the Financial Times, and several other major outlets. His media appearances include Bloomberg and BBC Television, and he's been a guest lecturer at Dartmouth Stuck School of Business. As a leading consultant, on the subjects of growth and innovation for past dozen years or thereabouts, Steve has he's been a long-time colleague of Harvard Business School professor Clay Christensen in building up his innovation consulting business, InnoSight, where he led 3 industry practices. He has co-written articles with Professor Christensen, and he has helped to put together his book on healthcare, the innovator's prescription, right? He's also spent several years consulting at Bain & Company in their Boston and London offices. Wunker, he's also founded New Market Advisors, his company in 2009. And he advises innovative companies that include Nike, PepsiCo, Microsoft, Mahindra, and Cognizant, amongst others. Now, as an entrepreneur and as a corporate venturer, Wunker has been a pioneer in the development and the use of smartphones. He's led the team creating, one of the first, as I just mentioned, and that was as far back as late 90s. And since then, he has created a trailblazing, set of companies in mobile, marketing, commerce, and social networking. Steve's international experience is vast, and his companies have been based in US, UK, Netherlands, South Africa, and Zambia. So, turning to today's discussions. First of all, with the coronavirus disrupting organizations and communities across the world, we are living in highly uncertain times. Yet businesses still need to make decisions that, of course, have long-term repercussions. Even while managing through the coronavirus crisis that is ongoing, as business leaders and as managers, you're expected to plan for what these decisions now will mean in the future. Strategic plans that fail to account for the uncertainty and change can really become dangerous documents. They tend to give a false sense of certainty about the future and restrict the frame of reference when making key decisions. I would say that while being important, such plans may, distract attention from executives, diverging beliefs, about a business, and instead they gloss over major issues by directing a company towards, just a host of a big long laundry list of so-called strategic priorities that guarantee, that the company executes very few things, that it otherwise could have done very well. The stresses, that are being felt throughout the industries, because of these pandemic-related disruptions, they are of course causing great pain, and this can quickly, overturn long-standing competitive positions. It is critical to test how vulnerable key competitive advantages are to those stressors and their lasting impacts, right? And we all talk about these black swan events. The black swan events arising from public health or economy, natural disasters, new technologies, innovative business models, and so much more else. They both, they both tend to create threat as well as opportunity, right? Companies grasp, the threat. The opportunity created by this change, is much less obvious, oftentimes, right? So it is indeed an honor to share this virtual platform with you, Steve. And let me now welcome you once again, and thank you for making time for joining us here today. It's now my great privilege to request Steve to share his perspectives. Steve, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sonny. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the context that you were able to give as well. So I'm going to do let's see. Fabulous. Apologies, I think I may have just lost the connection. Is my sound okay?
Yes,
very good. Apologies. Well, look, it's a pleasure, and hopefully that's the last time we lose this connection. It's about 25 years ago, and I was in business school at Harvard, and my wife was in grad school at Harvard. And she got a summer job in strategic planning. This was her first, big opportunity. And I went to a bookstore, because we went to actual physical bookstores back then in the 90s. And I found a book on strategic planning to give her that was called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning. It was by a Canadian academic. And essentially the thesis was that strategic planning had run its course and was no longer useful in a time of rapid change. And I gave that to her all excited. And that has got to rank among the least popular gifts I have ever given my wife. It was possibly outranked by the sewing machine one year. But she said, well, what good is this to me? I'm in a strategic planning role. I need to not just say this is useless, but I need to actually make it better. I know that there is a rapidly changing world. The internet was just beginning to be popular, lots was changing, but you still had to do something. So we have a lot of people now saying it's impossible to know the future, it's impossible to plan for the future, and that is not very helpful because we do need to plan. And what I've been attracted to since that time, a quarter of a century ago, was situations of rapid change. Whether it was the rise of the internet in the 90s, or the dawn of the smartphone era in the early 2000s, or everything that my company, New Markets Advisors, does much more recently. It's how do you create a growth plan when there's so much uncertainty and ambiguity around you? Because the toolkit that I learned at Harvard Business School that I initially employed at Bain & Company was suited for more stable times. So I'm going to share with you the lessons that I've gotten from the past 16 years, first consulting with Clayton Christensen, who originated the concept of disruptive innovation and jobs to be done and other things, and then more recently leading new markets advisors. And I'm going to share with you, as Mr. Soni said, we have 3 books, Capturing New Markets, Jobs to be Done, and Conservation. And I'll be drawing from all 3 of those. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is that strategic plans are necessary. I had it dead wrong, both in terms of my awareness of how to be a good husband, maybe back in the mid-90s, and the sort of presence that one actually gives to a wife when she's starting one of her first professional jobs. But also I had it wrong in terms of really diminishing the importance of long-term. So, the first thing to note on that is that we need, in times of rapid flux, to make considered bets. Now, look, we are in a time of extraordinarily rapid change. Arguably, we have never seen as much change for the average human being in the past year as we've seen in all of human history. And yet we can't just say there's change we can't really know. You need to make those considered bets, because in those times of flux, there emerge the winners. That happened certainly in the 1990s, it happened in the financial crisis. It's happened at a lot of times of massive change. The post-war demobilization of the developed world in 1945. Some great enterprises were created and grown in those times because they were able to take those considered bets. And as you're living with all of this change, you also need to have some vision about what the future is going to be. Now, you have to balance that vision with humility, because there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty. We can't just wave that away. And yet there are still some very clear trends. And through a robust, open, rigorous, structured discussion with your colleagues, you're likely to be able to arise at both a common vision, and then maybe there are permutations of that vision that you need to plan for. But they can at least be very well stipulated and laid out so that everybody is speaking from sort of the same reference point. And then as change happens, you need to be able to both minimize the risk and seize the opportunity. We've been collaborating with a former client of ours, Jonathan Brill, who is the global futurist at HP, and he has a book coming out in springtime called Rogue Waves. And Jonathan's thesis is that there are a lot of trends out there, and we can map the trends. One of the remarkable things about the current day is that we have trends that rapidly intersect. And through that rapid intersection, sometimes trends accentuate each other, much like waves can do in the ocean. And so you get what seems to be this gigantic swell out there in the ocean, where really it's the intersection of a couple waves that are coming together. And that's what we saw with COVID, right? There's been warnings for a very long time about the potential emergences of disease. But we had that on top of rapid globalization. And then on top, at least in my country here in the United States, the widespread denial of science. And as these things come together, you get the makings of catastrophe. But look, you also have the makings of great opportunity for those who are prepared to seize it. Times of great change break inertia, and they enable people to adopt new habits, new solutions to long-standing problems. And so you need to be able to spot and then seize those opportunities. And strategic plans make that happen. So given that you're attending a session like this, you probably didn't need to be convinced that strategic planning is very important. What I do need to say is the other side of the coin. What are some of the issues that you might be confronting. So we have, for one, the presumption of certainty. Traditional strategic planning has typically taken a very consensus-based view of the future. More often than not, it's been about extrapolation of trend lines. When I tried doing that in the mid-90s, we could get it very right in some industries like credit cards that we were servicing or die casting. However, when it came to assessing the potential of the flat screen TV or the ebook, we got it completely wrong because we didn't really understand the dynamism of it. So let's not presume because it's easy that there is certainty about the future. Clearly there's not. And we can deal with that in a rigorous sort of way. Secondly, there are these rapidly arising vulnerabilities as well as opportunities, right? There are these rogue waves that appear out there. Somewhat complacent ambitious, it can still have a presumption sort of play out in ways that have been predicted in the plan. And so you need to be able to accommodate unpredictable, but their timing and the way that they may intersect still is considerable uncertainty. And so you have to plan and structuring that uncertainty. We'll talk about a process on how to do that. There's certainly an appeal of one agreed vision of the future, and that is all the more the case when you have a process that's highly inclusive for strategic planning. So, look, I am usually a big fan of having an planning because it enables buy-in, and through having the buy-in, it enables execution. The danger of that in rapidly changing times is that as you expand the group of stakeholders that participate in that strategic plan, you tend to average out the outliers. The people who might see things very differently push you to believe that there are some very distinct opportunities out there. And so you need to be able to have maybe a cater group that can really have a very robust, frank, and sometimes conflictual discussion about where everything might play out. Next, you have the danger of fuzzy objectives. Now, look, fuzzy objectives are a hazard in strategic planning in almost any year, right? We are going to be the leader in our industry. Well, what the heck does that mean? We're going to be the choice place to work. We need to have specificity in plans, whatever the context. However, in a time of rapid uncertainty as change, it's even more important to be able to have very clear objectives about what you are trying to do, but equally what you are not trying to do. What is not in the strategic plan? What is not a priority? Otherwise, the temptation is to spread your bets very, very widely. And in doing so, you really diminish the opportunity to make a considered impact in the scenarios that you think are going to be the most impactful. Whether they're the most probable or not is a separate question, but whether they're the most impactful sort of mandates a need to have some very clear objectives under those scenarios. And then finally, there is resource lock-in in the strategic plan. We have our annual budgeting cycles. And look, I understand the need for budgeting and planning. But maybe 2021 is a little less uncertain than 2020, but there is still a tremendous amount of uncertainty out there for almost any industry. And so putting in a little bit more flexibility in enable you to execute that strategy that you have in very different ways. It doesn't mean changing your strategy, but it means that the choice of actually what you prioritize within that strategy and how you execute upon it may very well change. And so keeping resource flexibility is especially important in those times of flux. So there is a better process on how to do this, and that's going to be the emphasis of my discussion with you today. And it goes through these 5 steps of starting out with future casting. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. And then based upon that, you'll define the very specific challenges and priorities that you're trying to solve for. Strategic planning is an answer to a question, right? But if the question is not very well articulated, then the answer can be a little bit fuzzy and off-point. And then you really need to think multidimensionally about how you can move it. Now more than ever, I think we've seen more multidimensional innovation as a response to the pandemic than at almost any time in history. There has to be experimentation. The way you experiment is going to be very different, right? Some markets have much longer lead times. Some markets are very highly regulated. Some aren't. So the way you approach experimentation is going to be distinct. But through experimentation, you can embrace a degree of humility. Humility is particularly important to have in a time of rapid change, as is vision. And that is the conundrum that people need to thread. They need to have the vision, they need to have the purpose, they need to inspire, and yet at the same time, they also need to be humble. If you can master that trick of having those two ordinarily contrary principles being really inculcated in your leadership at the same time, then you're well along the road to creating and implementing an effective strategic plan. And then finally, you need to scale fast. You cannot be caught in pilot hell or endless cycles of experimentation. This is a time of rapid change and opportunity. So experimenting with purpose means that you rapidly resolve the uncertainties that you have, and then you go for it and you scale fast. So let's peel that back a little bit and look at very specifically what we mean by each of these 5 steps. So the process of future casting is related to scenario planning, but it's beyond that. So on the left side of this page, we have a process of basically of scenario planning, whereby you identify the trends that you might have that might affect your business. Those can be economic, for sure, very industry specific. They can be political, they might be societal or technological. But you want to look broadly at those trends, both in the normal day-to-day business that you look at, but also much more beyond that into the context of both your business, but also your customers' lives or businesses to understand all the influences. And you need to look at how these might intersect, particularly within the short to medium term time frame, given that the very long term is even more uncertain than it usually is these days. But certainly in the short to medium term, you might look at how the confluence of these trends creates very specific sorts of situations. Now, some trends are going to be more knowable than others. And so you'll have more certainty around some trends, and you can sort of classify these as very clear trends, right? We think the continuation of urbanization, although we've certainly seen a little bit of a change in that in some economies recently. The continual bifurcation of incomes. These are trends that, at least in the United States, have been a very long term that we know that those are happening. And then there are other trends that can be much more uncertain, both in terms of whether they play out and the timing of which they play out. And so you separate those out into different categories. And then you map out how these intersect, thinking about sort of, you can even create a matrix, right, where the rows are the trends that you know, and then the columns are the ones that you don't. And you sort of think about how these things intersect in different permutations. And then that can create very distinct scenarios. Now, look, we live in a world of infinite futures, right? And having 50 different scenarios is really not very helpful to strategic planning. And so it needs to be a tractable sort of number where you can really bring and focus your energies to figuring out what these trends mean for you. So typically we would advocate for perhaps 4 scenarios. There is a pessimistic scenario, there is an optimistic scenario. There might be a middle case scenario, although beware of that middle case becoming just sort of the consensus watering down documents. I started out my career at the United Nations, and that was the modus operandi at the UN. We had the consensus watering down of documents because that got agreement and that got consensus, and we operated largely by consensus. But businesses are not the United Nations. And so you want to be able to look at these two extremes. And then the fourth scenario would be something that's just different, something that operates with a very different situation playing. So you want to force yourself to think in a rigorous way about what that would mean, and not just sort of wave it away as saying, well, that's unlikely and that's unfamiliar and that's hard to plan for, so we're not going to pay attention to it. This is why you're conducting the exercise, to be able to force yourself to think about the situation. And you want to think about how this affects you, but you also want to put yourself or your colleagues into the roles of competitors, so that they can think about, well, if I'm competitor A or B, how would I react in this sort of scenario? So oftentimes they have very different starting points, and so therefore their logical actions would be potentially somewhat different. And then you want to be able, of course, to keep adapting. Adaptation requires that you sort of know what you're adapting to. It requires that awareness of a situation, which means that you need to pretty much continually look at how these trends are playing out, and then have periodic meetings. Doesn't have to be every month, right? It might be twice a year, where you look at how is the world evolving. And are there particular scenarios that are coming to pass more than others, so that you don't just sort of put it out of your mind after having done it at the start of the year, but you really revisit this, and that can enable an adaptation process. So then you have that context, but then you can also sort of sort out what you think that means into what we call the uncertainty matrix, which is an extremely useful tool in these situations. Now, this derives from former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who was talking about his ill-fated war in Iraq, and talking about the known knowns and the known unknowns. What he said really worried him, and very rightly so, were the unknown unknowns. What he did not know, he didn't know. So that was prophetic indeed. But this sort of matrix can be very useful for a corporate strategic planning process as well. So think about each of these quadrants, where you have, so if you can look at the axes here. On the y-axis, we have the accessibility of data, and the x-axis is the uncertainty around those risks and assumptions. So up in the top left-hand side, we have those known knowns. And in that case, you want to put them there, and if they're truly known, great. But you may also want to step back and challenge those truths a little bit and ask, how do we know that that's true today, as well as going forward into these scenarios that we've laid out? Is there conventional wisdom about an industry that's wrong? Look, if you can find conventional wisdom that's wrong, that is a huge opportunity to abandon an industry. So do challenge those things that you think you know. And then there are the unknown knowns on the upper right-hand side of this, things that the organization does know somewhere, but is not known to the group that is doing strategic planning. So then you have to sort of reach out and get the input. That doesn't mean necessarily get their collaboration in the whole decision-making process, but at least get their inputs into the plan. Frequently, that knowledge lies at sort of the periphery of the organization. It lies in people who are interacting with customers day to day, or it lies in maybe smaller affiliates of an organization that might be operating, some Middle East or other sort of secondary markets for your organizations. So you want to be able to reach out there and understand what's being felt at the periphery, and bring that in, collaborate, so you get a better sense about what the organization actually knows, which you may not in the sanctum of strategic planning. And then you have these known unknowns. So there you want to really distill that down to key assumptions. One thing we often do in a strategic planning engagement is talk with people, the stakeholders, at the start of that. And what we're really doing is trying to understand what is their construct of the future, and what are the challenges and opportunities that an organization confronts. And underlying that, what are the assumptions that drive that construct? And in particular, we're trying to listen for how those constructs diverge between key stakeholders. And we're really pushing, and it's sort of like a psychotherapist is pushing to understand the underlying layers of interpretation that exist in somebody's mind. We are trying to uncover what are the underlying assumptions that may not be articulated, but which drive those divergences and how people view the contexts and opportunities for their businesses. So you want to be able to find those assumptions, and then to the degree that you can test those through very rapid market research or customer engagement or industry analysis, regulatory analysis, you name it, then you can do that in a super quick sort of manner and take a lot of those assumptions off the table or create much more of a consensus by bringing more fact to what is often a sort of corporate religion battle of people who have these very deeply held faiths but have trouble articulating all of the assumptions that underlie those faiths. And then finally, we have the quadrant here that really tripped up Donald Rumsfeld in the Iraq War, which are those unknown unknowns. So to uncover those, you want to be able to use those scenarios, but also exercises like word naming, where you have your colleagues play the role of competitors, for instance. And as you sort of interact through discussing how people might react to different scenarios, you can uncover those unknown ones. When you can do that, that can be really powerful, because that is usually visibility into the future that your competitors do not have. And so that can create a major advantage by surfacing those unknown elements. So that's the process of future casting. And look, this sounds very involved. It doesn't need to be rigorous. It does not need to be super lengthy. You can execute this in the space of 2 or 3 months. I do not advocate doing it in the space of a one-day strategic planning workshop, which is the temptation that people have. But with one day, people tend to sort of very quickly sort of gravitate towards what's easy to focus on. And that is usually what's familiar. It's hard for people to really think about very alternative futures, very different ways to interact. And so people do need a little bit of time to play that through. So then secondly, you need to establish what are the challenges and priorities. So what are the questions that your strategic plan is going to answer? We have here a list of 7, and these are fairly common. Usually it's a much more extensive list for a particular company's context. What sort of things do you want to prioritize? Are you looking to be more offensive or defensive? Are you looking to play big or play small, or have a lot of bets or just a few considered ones? Are you trying to, what is the basic strategic imperative here? Are you trying to raise your prices or lock in customers or expand into new growth areas because of limited prospects in your current core business? Any one of a number of things that vary depending on the organization that you work for. But you need to sort of have those because then that really sets very clear guidelines for what is and isn't on target as you create these potential responses. What are your financial goals? Are you trying to get 50 million or 100 million or 5 million? Talking about dollars, not rupees, from some of these opportunities, or is it a different order of magnitude? How much risk are you going to take on? There's going to be risk. Let's not assume away the risk. But what types of risk are there? Is it technological? Is it mainly about market acceptance? Is it regulatory? And what sort of time frame are you willing to work with? Right, so you can add to this list, but this is a way to get you started to think about some of the questions that you need to answer ex ante before you really set the strategies, because these allow you to sort of assess whether a strategy is responsive to your strategic imperatives. So now, third, we have innovate multidimensionally. And here I borrowed a graphic from our friends at Lloyd Doblin. I did a working paper with them a few years ago on what's called the 10 types of innovation. And we had laid out here a variety of ways that companies can innovate. And most innovation is focused at the center. It's focused on the offering, on product performance and the product system. But you really want to force yourself to think beyond that. We'll often do brainstorming exercises with organizations where we force people to think of 3 new ideas regarding the profit model or the ecosystem or sales channels that you might be working through. Well, human creativity is a fundamentally lazy impulse that we have. If we tell people to come up with one idea, they will typically come up with one idea. If we push them for 5 ideas, sometimes they'll come up with 5 ideas. So you want to really push your ambitions and force people to think of these different lanes, these 10 different lanes. And then you want to sort of integrate that and think about how these might come together. So there was a study done of 5,000 innovations, and were these innovations really successful or not? The average rate of return on those innovations was dismal. It was terrible. It was 4.5%. Why are we innovating? Let's just go home. I mean, it's depressing. However, of those innovations, there were 100 of the 5,000, 2% of the sample, that drove more than 90% of the cumulative total returns of all of the sample. Those innovations had at least 5 or 6 of these 10 types of innovation deployed. And almost always they deployed innovation in the profit model and in the customer experience. So why is that? Why would it be that these innovations would be so much more successful than the average? So the answer is that those innovations are typically much more responsive to the actual customer need. Rare is the customer who says, I just need an R&D innovation, or I really just need a sales channel innovation. They need to have things, look, product innovation is good. I'm not dismissing the potential product innovation, but oftentimes those need to be sold in different ways. You might monetize in different ways. They might call upon a different ecosystem to come together. And that is actually responsive to the underlying job to be done that a customer has, rather than what you happen to be selling. It's what the customer actually needs. It was Peter Drucker, the greatest management theorist of the 20th century, who once wrote, "The customer rarely buys what the company thinks it is selling." It's very profound, right? So think about what the customer is actually buying and not what you happen to be selling. And oftentimes what they're buying is put together across these 10 different things. And maybe they are cobbling it together themselves, some of what they're buying, but they need a solution, not just product. So the 10 types of innovation enables you to deliver a solution. One of the other reasons that those are so profitable is that delivering a solution often creates a whole lot more value than just a product, so you can price for that. And it's hard to do. It's hard to copy. So we're not saying that every innovation needs to deploy the 10 types of innovation. That would be extraordinarily difficult to execute. But for the big bets that you are going to make, you need to think multidimensionally about how you can really create a solution and not just a product. Fourth, experiment with purpose. So as you reduce the risk in a new concept business model, what have you, you rapidly increase the value. I have a friend in the Boston area who's a longstanding venture capitalist. And, I asked him once, how do you describe your job to somebody who's not very familiar with business? And he said, oh, that's easy. I say I'm in the risk reduction business. But he is not talking about insurance. He's talking about venture capital. Because he believes with a small Series A investment, you can take a whole lot of risk off the table. And so then you can, if they are successful, you can rapidly increase the value of an entity to the point where it gets a Series B and Series C and so forth. And then that earns a lot more money to be invested. In the average venture capital portfolio, out of every 10 investments, 6 or 7 are complete write-offs, lose all the money. 1 or 2 sort of break even, make back the money. There's existence, some sort of zombie state. They do reasonably okay. And it's only 1 or 2 out of the 10 that create all of the returns for the portfolio. And yet, even with that super high failure rate, the average returns of a venture capital portfolio adjusted for the industry. So this is not just saying that they invest in high growth industries, so therefore they get high returns. Adjusting for the industries that they concentrate on, they make 25% more than the average public company with that high failure rate. So the way they do that is that when they fail very early and very cheaply because they are experimenting with purpose. They are not trying to build a miniature version of the whole company, the whole proposition for customers. They are looking in a very targeted manner. And what they're actually doing is deploying the scientific method. So it is unbelievably ironic that the scientific method may be one of the most important innovations in human history. And yet we confine it to the R&D department. That there is no law that says the scientific method needs to be confined to science and R&D. It is a very robust process for business experimentation as well. And yet it is extraordinarily rare to find enterprises that think about their business experiments in any sort of systematic, rigorous sort of way. The scientific method enables you to start doing that. And as you can do that, you can then really prioritize your risks. Take off the table those deal killer risks, the huge things that, well, if we can't validate this assumption, this whole proposition is just negated. And then there are things that have path dependency. Well, we need to resolve this in order to determine if we're going to develop this product, this business model, this new sales channel along one path or another path, for instance. And then as you get further down this curve, you think about those easy win, high ROI sort of risks. A few years ago, McDonald's had an idea to serve shrimp salad at its restaurants. So sometimes I bring this to groups, and we do sort of like a mock planning session for people who are not in the restaurant industry. Say, okay, well, at McDonald's, we've got this idea of serving shrimp salad. What are we going to do? And so, some people will say, okay, well, let's go do a test market in 100 stores. Okay, let's go do a focus group. Okay. Let's go look at whether shrimp is popular. Let's see the price of shrimp. You know what McDonald's actually did? They looked at the worldwide supply of shrimp and how price elastic that was. So how much demand could impact that supply of shrimp. And then they calculated based on their tens of thousands of stores. If they sold a modest amount of shrimp salad in each store, what would that do? And it would actually have a material impact on the worldwide demand of shrimp and significantly raise the price of shrimp to the point where this proposition would no longer be viable. So in the course of an afternoon of desk research, they were able to dispense with the idea. So that is the definition of an easy win, high ROI risk that was elucidated by having a rigorous process about thinking about what these risks are. And finally, we have scaling fast. How do you actually really build up this business in a fairly quick way once you're able to take these risks off the table? Don't get stuck into pilot hell forever, because there's always going to be uncertainty. Rather, you want to find a foothold market early on, resolve those uncertainties, and be able to grow quickly. So a foothold market does not mean a marquee, super prestigious sort of customer. It means customer, end market, what have you, depending upon your industry, where you can get a very quick start and learn and take some key risks off the table, and then have a reference to be able to develop more customers. I often bring clients another challenge that I faced in real life. So I started the first mobile commerce business in Africa for a Pan-African cellular network. And we had a choice early on. We had to affiliate with a banking institution for regulatory reasons. So Standard Chartered wanted to work with us. And then we had, what was it called? African Banking Corporation, which was based in Zimbabwe, had 3 branch offices and almost no IT system. So I tell people, should we have partnered with African Banking Corporation or Standard Chartered? 90% of the people will say, oh, Standard Chartered, you should go there. No, wrong. It was appropriate to go with African Banking Corporation. So Standard Chartered, while in Africa they were very interested, their IT organization was based in Kuala Lumpur. They couldn't give us the time of day. They had all sorts of levels of hierarchy to go through. Ultimately, this little experiment for something totally novel in a peripheral market for them wasn't very important. Whereas African Banking Corporation had essentially no IT organization, so that was one hurdle that was gone. They had almost no competitive advantages, so they needed us as a partner. I had the managing director's cell phone, so I could call him anytime, basically, and resolve an issue. We could get going very quickly and learn very fast. Then we went to Standard Chartered and Barclays and some of the bigger folks to partner after that. So find those footholds that may not be glamorous, but they enable you to get started very quickly, learn, and then adapt and move on. And then as you have a disciplined process to find uncertainties and resolve them, you can scale that very quickly, all the while laying those foundations for scaling rapidly, which often are longer lead time. Maybe they involve regulatory filings or IT systems or hiring certain specialists or sales channel education. And then as you grow, you still want to think about options. So you do need to have a plan, but you also need to think about, are there ways to open up new options, knowing that you're still going to get surprised and there might be more opportunities to uncover, as well as threats as you let this play out. So then, some of the key learnings, and then we'll transition over to more of the discussion. So strategic plans are necessary. I was wrong in the mid-90s, both as a strategic planner and as a husband, that you do need to support your spouse, but also you need to be able to really deploy a strategic plan in a context-sensitive sort of way. And so that means threading that needle, having the vision while coupling that with humility at the same time. And then we have this simple 5-step process that enables you to embrace that in a way that's appropriate, particularly for times like these. So with that, I am going to end these slides and we can have a bit of a discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. I'll speak for myself, and I know that I'm speaking on behalf of much of the very large audience that we have. It was indeed a great set of insights. You gave great examples, and I can tell you that the time that we have now to converse, it's going to be interesting. And my challenge is going to be, how do I do justice to the steady stream of questions that are coming in? And I had a few of my own. So if you want to take a drink of water, go ahead and do that, because we're going to dive into the Q&A right away.
I'm excited. Let's go.
Good deal. So let me pick up the first one. And what I've decided to do is I did go through as many questions as I could read while you were speaking, Steve, and I've tried to cluster a few of them together. So I'm going to just throw all of them at you, that are around a certain theme, and let's see how many we can take, while we have time. So, you spoke about the necessity of strategic plans, especially in times of crisis. And this year is seeing the most rapid, innovation disruption probably ever, right? And I want to ask you if your process of for the future, if that would scale well against it. That was a question I had. I'm going to put a couple more questions that came in from the audience that are thematically aligned, right? And in no particular order, there's one which is around. You mentioned of scenarios and war gaming, which was really interesting. But in a war, decision makers base plans on certain intelligence data coupled with assumptions. How does a CEO scenario plan for a crisis without any precedent? So that's one. I'm going to also ask another one question, which is kind of aligned with the same idea. As a consumer durable major, none of our strategic or even technical plans could factor in a crisis of this proportion. And as a board member or as a CEO, is there any way we can actually factor in black swan events in our decision framework? So it's kind of like in the same space. There are a couple, but why don't we go, and I'll try and see if I can pull out a couple more which are around this theme.
Sure. Cool. So we'll disaggregate those first, and then we'll see if there's any common theme. So I do agree that this is probably the time of greatest change for the average person ever. Maybe arguably 1939 or 1945, but it's very hard to find, for the average where times have changed more rapidly than today. It feels like there's a bit of a hubris saying that, right? It's always hard to judge your own time in historical context. But there is tremendous change right now, and you need that process. And look, one thing we have done is we forged that process, and other times have changed. We did it, back during the dawn of the smartphone era with Blake Christensen. We've done it in the financial crisis, and then there are other, of course, moments of rapid change in a particular industry or in a company's context too. So it does work. It's not easy. That none of this is easy, right? Because it requires taking yourself out of your everyday context, looking at the world in very different ways. And that's why I advocate you can't do it in a day. You do need, it doesn't take forever, but you do need a little bit of time to force yourself to do that. So that has enabled organizations to make fairly rapid shifts. And look, we've learned. I interviewed Jeff Bezos back in 2009. I learned a lot from Bezos about how he thought about things, right? This guy, he's very bright. And he comes up with ideas, just, talking idea. And yet he would be the first one to say, oh, I was wrong about this, I'm wrong about that. No, remember Z stores, that was a disaster. So, rare do you find the multi-billionaire who has that degree of humility. Reed Hastings and Netflix, I had a discussion with him too, around about that time. And at the time, they were just really doing DVDs by mail. They were starting to do streaming. And yet he had all these ideas and said, yeah, we're going to try this and try that. And what was really instructive is this was a very strange experience, but I was at this cocktail party. So it was Reed Hastings, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and me talking, which, one of these things is not like the others, right? But the NATO guy, great guy, and he was listening to that and saying, historically, our military planning has been utterly different than And yet he had recently headed the Southern Command for the United States, and was responsible for drug interdiction and insurrection and all sorts of things. And said, a lot of the world is coming to look more like that, and that's an environment where we have much more uncertainty. It's not like we're planning for the exact number of Russian tanks that are coming over the border. And so we need to become more like that, which means becoming more like you. So he was there grappling with how do we make, even in the military, this. So, that goes to, I think, your second question about in a war, people have great intelligence and assumptions. Well, yeah, historically, but not so much anymore. And so, even the military is trying to adapt thinking about very different scenarios. They still do it in a very rigorous way. It's the military, after all. But another thing they are doing is trying to devolve more autonomy down into the field. So special forces, for instance, are trained to make very rapid decisions on the ground with limited effects. And the Marines have a dictum that if you're 80% sure of the answer, go for it. It's a very action-biased organization. And some are different, right? Submariners do not operate like that. On a nuclear submarine, you don't go with 80% certainty. If you really need 100% certainty. But in the more expeditionary forces, you do. So whether there's a precedent or not, there are facts that are around you and probabilities, and you just have to sort of disaggregate that as rigorously as you can, much like in the military would today. Now, the black swan events. We can, as I spoke about with the trends analysis, you may not know which ones are going to materialize, but you can at least stipulate what some might be, and have some thinking about what you might do. But look, the average strategic plan, the great vulnerability is not the random black swans. It's things that are just distinct from the consensus-based scenario that people have. So we don't need to solve for global uncertainty here. We need to have be able to solve for maybe 3 or 4 distinct scenarios and think about the risks as well as the opportunities that are presented. It's very important that you think about these changes not just as a threat, but as an opportunity. There's been a lot of academic literature looking all the way back, like for instance, at how the newspaper industry responded to the internet. And the organizations that framed it as an opportunity did dramatically better than those who framed it as a threat.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve. You covered quite a good breadth of topics over there. I was particularly taken in by the comment you made out of your conversation with Bezos. Having vision, taking risks, but having the humility to to be open about what worked and what did not, right? Quite striking. Let's move ahead. You spoke about innovating multidimensionally, right? And you identified amongst other things. I think of the 2 top things you had identified, customer engagement as one of the biggest opportunity areas. It was quite striking, right? Now, in the context of the current times, right? So much has changed in terms of customer engagement. Face-to-face interaction, has been replaced by virtual meetings. No more opportunities to have informal interactions. No more dinners. Where you could meet up and really, be informal, right, with your clients. In short, the opportunity to understand and build trust, they have been minimized, right? In particular, people who are in customer-facing roles, selling roles, right? And they're facing challenges when they've been put into the scenario, in the situation where they have to work remotely, right? And these roles in the past, they've relied very heavily on in-person engagement, right? To build that trust, particularly when you're exploring a new client relationship. So, what's your advice? How do you suggest that they innovate over here? That's one question. Related to that, there is also a question that's come in from the audience. I'm going to just throw that out there as well, right? And the question goes like this, Steve. As an auto components major, our focus has been on process rather than product performance and systems. How would you advise us to broaden our vision to innovate multidimensionally? Is there a set framework or is there a model that they can follow? So I thought I'll just put the two of these questions together to you.
Terrific. So regarding customer engagement and like the sales process, I was speaking yesterday with a guy who leads North America for a large pharmaceutical company. And he had to transition a lot of his product portfolio this year because they had a biosimilar that came off market. And they significantly changed what they were selling, even the class of drugs that they were selling. But he said his greatest achievement, he thought, was really transitioning sales models. So they have 2,000 sales reps. And these are highly compensated reps, pharma sales in the United States. And they went from this model where they were engaging with these physicians and hospitals on an everyday basis when they had to go virtual. So we have actually have a working paper on our website. I should remember the title. Anyway, if you go to newmarketsadvisors.com, you'll see it under our working papers about how you redesign your B2B sales approach for the pandemic. Title is something like that. And he followed this process pretty strictly. So first they had to think about how their customers differed, not in the normal ways, but they segmented them in terms of what sort of interactions really matter to them and what were the activities that were undertaken by the sales team that related to these interactions. And some of them were fairly low value and could be migrated very easily to virtual channels. Some of them had to be really changed how they educated people about a new study. And face-to-face sales right now are not allowed because doctors' offices don't want more people in an office than necessary. But they'll come back very soon. And so then the thinking is, okay, so what are we really going to use face-to-face for in the future? And how might that be more limited, different, because it's expensive, right? And which of their customers might actually prefer virtual and different forms of virtual, and what can you really accomplish there? So it required a totally new way of thinking that included the segmentation. It deployed what we call in our most recent book, costovation, how do you use the tools of innovation on the cost side of the business, not just on the revenues. And then he was experimenting a lot this year. And it's hard in a sales organization to experiment rapidly. Right? These organizations don't like experimentation typically. You're messing around with somebody's sales incentives. You might be messing around with their customer relationships that they very much prize. So you need to really constrain those experiments before you can then scale it up. But they did so quite effectively. So I think that is the process. It's segmentation. It's thinking imaginatively about what do you do and how can you do it differently. And then it's the process of disciplined experimentation. And that also applies to your second question then, about how do you think about the system rather than the process. What I would advocate there is that you also really think about the customer insight. So the title of our second book is called Jobs to be Done, and this derives from Clay Christensen, where he was saying that people don't go out to buy a product or service. They're trying to get something done in their lives. They have a job they're trying to get done in their lives. And oftentimes they have to cobble together that solution from a variety of different sources. So in order to really innovate, you need to understand what people are fundamentally trying to get done and what your real competition is, which might be direct competition, but might also be totally orthogonal, asymmetric ways of getting things done. And then that allows you to solve for something, right? Innovation in and of itself is neither good nor bad, right? It is the answer to a question. And the question is, how do you better satisfy and secure and get more money out of your customers? And to do that, you really need to start from a customer-centric point of view.
So Steve, good you touched upon jobs to be done, because I do have an audience question on that, and I'm just going to lay that out right now. So in a highly uncertain business environment, has the relevance of jobs to be done framework diminished, right? Your uncertainty matrix seems like a brilliant framework, so they're giving you a compliment there. But the question really is centered around, is the jobs to be done, concept of the framework still as relevant as it was earlier?
So look, we've seen a lot more demand this year for jobs to be done research. Because the great thing about jobs to be done is that they don't change very much, right? What you're doing, your current activities and approaches, that changes. And you need to think about that. You need to think about the action triggers as those change, and the obstacles to adopting new products, those change. So all that is relevant. But the fundamental thing that a customer is trying to get done, that stays fairly constant. So that's the North Star, right? If you can determine this is the North Star, this is what we're really trying to help somebody accomplish. And they've changed their mechanisms to accomplish it because of these 3 reasons. Fine, you have an understanding of that, but you can really know what you're trying to solve for. The beautiful, and another beautiful thing is that 3 years from now, that probably still hasn't changed. So particularly in sort of businesses where you need to set a fairly long-term plan because of your development cycles or other sorts of industry-specific factors, that jobs to be done understanding is super valuable.
Now, I concur with you. By the way, my own point of view, was exactly the same. It's pretty evergreen. The notion, the idea that you all laid out, right? With jobs to be done. And moving to my next question, Steve. Sticking to the idea of your books now. You're the author of 3 very popular books on innovation. What else is in the works? What are you working on currently?
Of course, there has to be something, right? An innovator can't stop innovating. It's not my DNA to just stop. So the next book is about how do you make an organization more innovative? How do you really infuse this throughout an organization? And initially it was to be titled Culture of Innovation, and we sort of realized, well, it's a lot more than culture, so that's not the appropriate title. So we're still searching for that magic title. That will come out next year. And look, I think the analogy is sort of like you think about a house, right? When we look at a house from the street, we look at the outside of the house, and we might notice some of the surface features of it and admire those. But you don't start a house there, right? You start with an architect and a plan. And is this going to be open plan living? Is it going to be smaller rooms? How many bedrooms? How much outdoor access is there going to be? And then you need a foundation, and you need load-bearing walls, and plumbing, and the electrical systems. And then on top of that, you put the stuff that's visible. And the problem with making an organization more innovative is a lot of people just start with what's visible. Right? And painting the walls purple and buying a lot of ping pong tables does not make an organization more innovative. These are the surface manifestations. And the culture as well is a manifestation of that. It's very important, but it is a lagging variable. It's not a leading variable. You don't start by changing the culture. You start by understanding what are we trying to innovate for? What are the strategic imperatives? Is innovation everybody's job or just a few people's job? And then what are the mechanisms that facilitate that innovation? How do we fund it? How do we select for it? How do we reward it? If people fail, what do we do about that? How do we scale things? How do we push it out into the organization? Is it more internally created or generated by an ecosystem? Those sorts of decisions must precede then the culture of it, because you can actually pursue innovation in very different ways. You can be very bottom up like Google. You can be very top down like Apple. You can be very ecosystem oriented like Facebook. None of those is better or worse than the others, but they're different. And so you need to understand what your model should be in order to develop it well.
So, we're going to look forward to that book coming out. You've already got me excited for sure. And the topics that you touched, that extends the whole body of work that you've been working on. So I think, it's a perfect sort of complement to what you've already laid out over there, Steve. So thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. I'm going to move on, and but I do have a quick question, regarding your books. And now that you're on to your fourth one, right? Where do you draw your inspiration from? And I'll put out a related question to that. You're well traveled across India. You're no stranger here. You've been here many, many times. Is there anything in particular about your experiences or your interactions here in India that have struck you, or something that's inspired you?
Well, look, the inspiration is easy. It's a wonderful thing about being a consultant, and is that I'm a bit of a tourist into a lot of organizations. And some are dysfunctional, some are extraordinarily functional, and you learn from all of that. I'm constantly learning, so that's great. And there's, I tell people in the company, look, we can be in business 500 years from now, right? People are always going to have challenges around growth strategy and innovation. So that is a perennial, right? And it's attractive to me because it's challenging. So there's lots of problems to solve for. Look, I think India is extraordinarily well positioned in an innovation economy for many reasons, but a couple that I'll highlight. India is the only place I have ever really had to sit down with a client and say, privately, I think you're being too ambitious. You are reaching for the moon here, and you want to do that in 3 years. And wow, that's a lot of growth and change. And it's a guy I've known for a very long time. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, I know. Yeah. Tell me something I don't know. But that's what he was going to do, because he was super ambitious. And look, I think that is part of the culture, the business culture. And it's, I think, one reason you see a lot of Indian CEOs of major tech companies worldwide. But there's another cultural factor. I was doing a speech once in India, and the person before me was talking about how people eat, and he compared the French style of eating to the Indian. Whereas, in France, you have all these set courses, and you have an exact place for everything on the table, and it's very proper, and it's structured by the chef, and you sort of follow the procedure in a very appropriate sort of way. And in India, it's sort of around the table, and it's served at once, and we have a bit of this and a bit of that. And the world is moving towards Indian style eating, right? We do not live in a French dining experience sort of 5-course meal anymore, right? There's a bit of this opportunity and a bit of that, and there's more uncertainty and less structure. And, as people grow up in Indian organizations, they learn how to deal with that. And that's an extraordinarily useful skill as the world moves into this multi-dimensional innovation sort of realm.
Yeah. Those are great insights, and that was, the dining metaphor. I remember that. That was pretty unique, but pretty true. It resonates, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on to another one, aspect, which is kind of related to what you've spoken to us today. Now, granted, strategic planning is critical. You made a very, very emphatic, case for that. But it's about ensuring the execution that's going to be, key to your success, right? And in the event of a crisis, where your focus for immediate action or execution, is going to be towards the near term, right? Get things under control and so forth, right? What are your thoughts, right? Around the work which organizations need to do in the area of execution, right? That complements, having a great, a strategic outlook, right? Which is nimble and agile, as you've pointed out.
Yeah, and this is, of course, the challenge of having a planning and pushing things in unfamiliar directions. And in doing so, maybe not having a super inclusive strategic planning process as well. So a couple of things. First, strategic plans need clarity. So avoid the buzzwords. You need to speak in very real terms, and you need to translate that into what is and isn't a priority. So not some abstract notion, but very specifically what is to be done, and equally what you are not going to prioritize. So that means cascading things down. One mechanism we use is starting with the strategies and then translating that into very particular goals, business goals that you're trying to reach. And then those goals go into objectives, which are often quantifiable. And then from those objectives, then you have metrics, and those metrics are very quantifiable. Moreover, the metrics can be disaggregated into input metrics. So what are you going to invest in this? Which is not just money, but it's time, effort, partnerships. There are outputs, which are obviously very critical, but sometimes outputs can take a while to materialize. And then there are process metrics that show that you haven't just invested, but you actually have things underway, and you're sort of inputting the sustained energy into some of these initiatives. People will ultimately do what they're measured to do, but you need to be able to sort of cascade it down and understand the whole and why these things at a very granular level relate to the more macro sort of imperatives, and take some things off people's plates through that process of focus. That will really help in communicating and operationalizing the strategic plan.
Thanks, Steve. I did want to make sure that we got that aspect of it covered as well. Okay, so we are we have a list of questions, and I'm just trying to decide which one I pick because we've got a few minutes. Are you flexible, Steve? Can we go over by about 5 to 7 minutes?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Thanks. So I'm going to pick up a question from the audience, and this one is around risk appetite. And the question goes like this. Research suggests that investing and scaling up rapidly are both better done during times of crisis. Do you agree with that? And there is always a lack of confidence from a decision maker's perspective that hinders being risk averse, right? So, I guess, never the notion of, never let a crisis go waste. And I think that's where, he or she is starting from. But, I think you want to know, the whole notion around being risk averse.
Mm-hmm. I learned this lesson a long time ago. I had a professor at Harvard Business School who was reputedly the wealthiest professor at HBS, tens of millions of dollars. And he had made his money not in some glamorous tech industry, he made it in paper. And he said, and he's a professor of entrepreneurial management, he said, look, the way I made this was pretty simple. Paper making is a very fixed cost sort of business. There's a big capital investment you make, and then you sort of maximize the returns from that. And what that means is that there are times when the industry is over capacity. And then when that happens, prices plummet and there's a great crisis. And he had looked at these organizations he was competing against because they'd been in this business a long time. And in times of crisis, they had very ingrained habits of really sort of battening down the hatches and being super conservative and cautious. And so he decided to be countercyclical. And when there was great crisis, that's when he would invest. And he made a ton of money through doing that. Because it was a very predictable response, right? So your questioner is exactly right. In crisis, people become very risk averse. They pull in, they don't look at the opportunity, they look at the threat, right? There's a lot of behavioral psychology that says that we tend to view things as threats more than as opportunities. We're more loss averse than we are, risk neutral. But mathematics is risk neutral. It's not human psychology. So, at that time, you really need to think about the opportunity and invest. That doesn't mean spending crazy sums of money on wild bets, right? But there can be a portfolio, which most companies outside of pharmaceuticals, most companies don't have this. They haven't thought about their portfolio of bets for the future and the time frame for their realization and how risky they are. So you'll see in a pharma company, they have small adjacency extensions, isomer of a molecule, or something that's a follow-on. They've bolted an atom onto a molecule or something. But then they'll also have new approaches to commonly understood disease pathways. And then they'll have new disease pathways. And oftentimes actually, you'll see organizations have like an Alzheimer's treatment, which is extraordinarily risky because the disease is still not very well understood. But whoever cracks that is going to make $1 bajillion. So, they'll have that too. So think about your portfolio in that sort of way and keep that balanced even in those times of crisis.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve. And I can tell you, the HBS professor friend of yours, there are a couple of examples here in India, people who operate exactly in that counter-cyclical way, as you put it. So thanks for that. I'm going to pick another question. I was itching to ask you this, and there's an audience question that is kind of like thematically aligned with this. So, this one is around, what we've observed now in times like this, the bigger getting bigger, the small is getting smaller, right? And the smaller firms really don't have the reserves to last for too long, right? In a crisis like this. And if I bring it closer home to the Indian context, a very high majority of companies or firms in India, something upwards of 95, 97% of the companies are what we call here as MSMEs, the micro, small, and medium enterprises. And the question to you is, what's your advice to an MSME business, that's dealing with financial stress as it is, and there's been stress on account of cash flow issues, fall in demand, et cetera, right? How do you balance the struggle for survival versus, like you said, seizing the opportunity, right? What would you say to someone like that? And there's an audience question that I'm going to lay out along with this. And the question goes like this. As an MSME in the hydraulic space, we faced a massive cash crunch in the wake of the pandemic. In this scenario, how can we actually invest in innovating, especially for the long term?
Right. Well, look, my overarching response to that would be that there's no law that says that innovation is only about the revenue side of the business, the revenue side of the income statement. You can equally apply the tools of innovation to the cost side of the business. In my most recent book, Cost Ovation, it's all about that. And oftentimes what you want to do is think in different ways about what really drives cost. And what I mean is that things that are not line items on your P&L, because you've probably already addressed your line items. But for instance, complexity of your product offering, or complexity of a diversity of customers that you are selling to, or designing your solutions for those corner cases of somewhat rare, influential but rare customers that are demanding certain things. And then you can think about those 10 types of innovation, but think about it on the cost side. So, it's often much cheaper to innovate on the customer experience and the interaction model, for instance, than it is in the product. So, and again, I'm not diminishing the importance of product innovation, but it takes a while, it's costly. So think about what else you can do in those different avenues. And oftentimes you'll find ways that can create something of a cost advantage. Oftentimes those costs are a lot faster to cut than on the revenue side of the business in terms of generating an impact. And then that can create a sustainable advantage going forward if you can just be one of the low-cost competitors in the marketplace.
That's very well put, and I think the whole notion of cost ovation fits very well, in this idea, right? And as you were speaking, I was sifting through, the long list of questions that I have, I want to take one final question, Steve, since you granted me the liberty of going a few minutes over, right? Just bear with me for a sec. So this is, let me pick this one. So this is about the whole idea of futurecast that you spoke about today. Under futurecast, how important is it to stay alert to the worst case scenario, especially given how the business has been massively affected, by the pandemic, right? So the focus on worst case scenario is what the questioner wants to know. Mm-hmm.
Look, you need to lay it out. You probably need something of a plan for it. Thankfully, it seldom comes to totally pass, although it certainly has for the cruise business, for instance, these days, right? So it can happen. But in doing so, you become alert to things that might signal that things could turn bad very quickly. And that's quite important, right? We tend to shut these things out. We don't like thinking about them. But making yourself aware of it in a rigorous way that forces people to confront these threats is useful not only for threat diminishment, but usually this threat is threatening your competitors too, right? So if that happens, then what can you do to seize the upside of that, right? Amazon was prepared. They had to hire 400,000 people. They were prepared to move quickly on opportunity. There were other organizations that were prepared for big spikes. We worked for one of the big social media companies. They're our largest client. They were prepared. They've done very well through the pandemic. Others were not, right? So you can turn change into opportunity as well as
that. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I'll say it for myself, and going by the questions and all the compliments that you've been getting, through the comments coming in from the audience, all of us have thoroughly enjoyed the last 90 minutes. Your thoughts, your insights, very well attuned to the times we are living in. More importantly, what lies ahead of us. So thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your thoughts, Steve. Loved it. Look forward to your next book, and more importantly, look forward to having you here amongst us. Sooner rather than later, as the situation normalizes. So, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. We've reached the end of the session, and I'm sure that you all would have taken away a few nuggets of wisdom out of Steve's insights, and wish you all a great evening, and wish you all great success with your businesses. With this, Jayasuriya, I'm going to turn this back over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stephen Wankar. Thank you very much, Mr. Sawhney. A very engaging session indeed. I think companies will not be viewing strategic plans the way they used to. So tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, we have the final session scheduled at 5 p.m. Strategy, Innovation and Uncertainty, and Eternal Golden Braid with Michael Rayner. So please do join us then. Thank you again, dear speakers, for sparing your time on behalf of CII. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. You have a great day, Steve. Bye.